Hello and welcome back to another PHP tutorial. So here we're going to look at the underpinning principles of PHP variables. So here we're going to cover declaring PHP variables, outputting the variable data, and then have a little look at variable scope. So think of a variable as a container, a place where we can store information. And then somewhere in our program we can then retrieve that information when we need it. To create a variable in PHP, simply use the $sign and then we name the variable. So for example, name. So there is a few rules that we need to remember when we're creating this variable. So the variable must start with a letter or an underscore. The variable cannot start with a number. So we couldn't have something like this, for example. That's not allowed. So a variable name can only contain alphanumeric characters and underscores. So we couldn't have, for example, the @ sign, for example, but we can definitely use the underscore. Okay, so those are the kind of general rules there. So the variable names, they are case sensitive. So for example, age is not the same as age, it's completely different. So you also need to remember that variables are case sensitive. So in order for us to actually put something into this container, we use the equal sign, and now we define what data we want to insert in our variable. So here, for example, we want to put a number. So we just type the number. Now if we make a new variable with name and let that equal a string, if we use a string, we have to use a double or single quotes. So here we have name. We can also store booleans, true or false. So for example, here I create a variable called info, and then I store the value true. Of course, you need to remember these are statements and they need to end with the semicolons. Okay, so now we know how to define a variable. The next thing we need to do is output the variable. So here we can use the keyword echo, and then we can use the variable name to reference the data that's stored within it. So here, for example, we're echoing out age. So here we're going to echo out the number 12. Of course, you need to remember the semicolon. There we go. So I guess this is where it starts to get interesting, because now we have values that are stored. We can do things like add them together, for example. So here you'd imagine now we have 12 plus 12. There we go. Now an interesting question for beginners is, what would happen if we add true and false together? So let's echo that. So we're going to plus what's stored in info, and then we're going to add that to what's stored in more. So in this case, these are booleans, so true and false. So what would be the outcome of this? Well, the answer to this is 1, because true represents 1 and false represents 0. So if I add these together, then it must represent 1. So at this point, it's probably good to introduce the fact that PHP is a loosely typed language. This basically means that you don't have to tell PHP which data type we're using. PHP will automatically associate the data type to the variable. So here, for example, I don't need to tell a PHP that this variable is going to store some numbers. And here, for example, I don't need to tell the variable it's going to store a string here. So PHP is a loosely typed language. So now we have some more variables. We want to output multiple variables and place them together. So we can do that or concatenate them by using the dot symbol. So first of all, let's output person. So here it's going to output my name is Mike, and then I need a space. So I can do this by, first I need to concatenate, so add some more data, so dot, and then the double brackets, and then I want a space, so I include a space. And then I can have another dot to concatenate more information. And now I want to output my name, I want to output, sorry, my age is 12, or I am 12. So I am space, concatenate again, and then the age. So here we now have an echo output of my name is Mike, I am 12. So you can see that looks just like that. So it is possible to utilize HTML inside of our echo. So we can echo out a BR, but first of all, let's just echo out the age and then concatenate that with a BR. And then we can do it again. So for example, we can concatenate the age again. So here what we should have is the age, a line break, and then the age again. I need the semicolon. There we go. Of course, we can do the same thing if you wanted a p tag or a larger set of HTML here. We could also include that and so on. As you move through understanding PHP in more detail, eventually you get to a point where you need to understand PHP Variable Scope. So PHP variables can be declared anywhere in the script, but what we must understand, it has a variable scope. So the scope of the variable is the part of the script where the variable can be referenced or used. So to give you a basic introduction to PHP Variable Scope. So variable scope's really important once you start utilizing functions and expanding on your PHP code. So we need to understand where a variable can be accessed. This is what we mean by variable scope. Where can the variables be accessed? So PHP has 3 different variable scopes: local, global, and static. So what we defined here is a global variable. So this can be accessed anywhere within our script, except for in a function. So for example, this function cannot access this variable. So if I run this test, this is a simple function called myTest. I try and echo out the age, and then I obviously run the function or call the function, so it tries to output echo. So if I run that, I receive an error, undefined variable, age. Because like I said, this is a global variable which cannot be accessed within a function. Likewise, with local variables, here we have a function and we have a new variable within this function, and this would be defined as a local variable or a variable with a local scope. So here, this local variable would only be accessible within this function. So if I try to access it here with new age, then we should receive an error. There we go, undefined variable, because this is a local variable only accessible within this function. So in PHP, we do have the global keyword. So if you remember, in this function, we couldn't access this global variable. But if we use the word global and then define the variable we want to access, we now can access the variable. So we echo the variable, in this case, this variable that equals 12, and we can now print it out on the screen. So if I refresh, you can see it now is accessible, number 12. So that's the PHP global keyword. Okay, so far we've discussed global and local variables. So let's have a look at the static keyword or a static variable. So here, for example, we have some money in the bank. We have 15. And then we increment it by 1. So what should output now is 16. There we go, 16. Now, if we wanted to check or add more money to it, then the problem we've got here is that this function, when we run this function, money is always then going to equal 15 again, even though we plus some more money. So what we want to try and do is create a static variable so that we can track this variable. So if we use the word static and then create this variable to make it a static variable and then run this program again, of course it begins with 16, but now if we run the test again, you can now see that the static variable is now going to equal 17. So you can see here that this variable isn't getting refreshed every time we run this function. It's not starting at 15. It's remembering the fact that we've added a number to it. So when we keep running this function, it's always going to add 1 to it. But the static variable is always going to retain that new information. There we go. So that's an example of a static variable.